Okay, so you have given us quite the challenge this time. A deep dive into the Gaza hostage crisis. It's March 2025, and things are, well, incredibly tense.
Yeah, definitely terrible.
There are still 24 people held hostage by Hamas, families on both sides, just caught in this awful limbo. And we've got former President Trump out there publicly threatening Hamas while secretly negotiating with them. It's a lot.
It's a very, very unusual situation. I mean, you've never seen a U.S. president try to directly negotiate with Hamas before.
Right.
They're designated as a terrorist organization, right? So this could be a huge shift in U.S. policy, but it's all happening with, like, so much at stake, and the clock is ticking.
Absolutely. So to understand all of this, I think we need to go back to October 2023. That's when Hamas launched that attack on Israel, just a devastating attack.
Right. That attack killed, I think, about 1,200 people, and 251 hostages were taken. And of course, that triggered a war, and the impact on both Israelis and Palestinians has just been devastating. Thousands of casualties on each side, widespread destruction in Gaza, and a humanitarian crisis that's just getting worse.
And during all of this, during this war, there have been a few attempts at ceasefires to try and get those hostages released. Can you walk us through what happened?
Sure. There have been two major ceasefires since the war began.
Okay.
The first one was in late 2023 that led to over 100 hostages being released. And then in January of this year, a second ceasefire. That one got 30 more hostages released, and also the bodies of 8 deceased hostages were returned.
So in both of those ceasefires, Israel basically released Palestinian detainees in exchange for the hostages, right?
Right, exactly.
It's a tough situation, right? Lives are hanging in the balance. But I'm curious, what about those Palestinian detainees who were released? Were all of them, directly involved in violent acts against Israel?
That's a really important point. The profiles of those detainees, they varied a lot. Some had been convicted of, yes, direct involvement in attacks, but others, they were held for things that Israel considered less severe. Things like just being a member of Hamas or even just being involved in protests. And so the release of some of these individuals, especially those who have been convicted of violent crimes, it's been very controversial. A lot of criticism within Israel about that.
Right. So we have these two ceasefires. Some hostages are brought home. But the January ceasefire, that one was structured in phases, am I right?
Yeah, that's right. The first phase was a 42-day truce that actually just expired recently.
Okay.
And the idea was that this would lead into a second phase. And in that phase, they would try to negotiate a permanent end to the war and get all the remaining hostages released.
Sounds promising, but I'm guessing there's a but here.
You're right to think that.
Yep.
The problem is Hamas is insisting that they move on to that second phase, those permanent ceasefire talks, before they'll release any more hostages. But Israel is saying, no. All the remaining hostages have to be released before we even think about those broader negotiations. And to put even more pressure on Hamas, they've imposed a total blockade on Gaza.
So it's a stalemate.
Yeah.
And then into this already super tense situation walks former President Trump. He makes this very dramatic last warning on Truth Social. Basically told Hamas, release all the hostages and the bodies immediately or face serious consequences. Even used phrases like, it's over for you, you are dead. Strong word.
No kidding. Trump's threats have really added fuel to the fire here.
Yeah.
It's a very confrontational way to go about it. And we don't know, is this going to force Hamas to give in, or will it push them even further away from negotiations? And this is especially concerning because the humanitarian situation in Gaza is already so bad. And what does a permanent ceasefire deal even look like?
That's a good question, actually.
Ugh.
Gets thrown around a lot, permanent ceasefire. But what would the specifics be? What are the main sticking points that would need to be worked out in a deal like that?
Well, from Hamas's point of view, a permanent ceasefire would mean a complete end to the Israeli blockade on Gaza. That's a big one.
Makes sense.
They also want Israel to release a lot more Palestinian prisoners beyond the ones that have already been released in these exchanges. And they want recognition that they are the legitimate government in Gaza and that they should have a role in any future talks about, the status of Palestinian territories.
So what about from Israel's perspective? What are their main demands for a permanent ceasefire?
Well, their top priority is security for their citizens. That means a complete end to the rocket attacks and any other violence from Gaza. They're also looking for guarantees that Hamas will disarm or at least, stop other militant groups in Gaza from rearming. And then the question of recognizing Hamas as a legitimate political entity, that's a huge sticking point. Many in Israel just see them as a terrorist organization that can't be trusted.
So it sounds like the gap between those two positions is pretty wide.
Yeah, it is.
And here's what I don't get. Trump is making these very public threats, but at the same time, his envoy, Adam Bowler, is secretly meeting with Hamas in Doha. Direct talks, one-on-one, with a group that the U.S. has labeled as a terrorist organization. That's never happened before.
It's a total break from decades of U.S. policy. It shows they're willing to try something different, even if it means talking to a group they've condemned for so long. The White House, they've confirmed that these talks are happening, saying, look, we need to get American hostages home. But details about what's actually being talked about, that's very limited.
Public threats and secret talks, like a good cop, bad cop routine, but on a global scale.
Right.
But what about Hamas? How do they see all of this, especially Trump getting involved like this?
Well, Hamas thinks that what Trump is doing is actually counterproductive to the peace that they're demanding as a condition for releasing the hostages. They say his public threats are making the Israeli government feel like they don't have to do a ceasefire, like they can just keep the blockade on Gaza, and that makes a peaceful resolution harder to reach. It's interesting. They see Trump as almost getting in the way.
Okay, help me understand that a little bit better. Why would Hamas see Trump as like an obstacle to peace?
I think it has a lot to do with how they see the relationship between Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. They think Trump is giving Netanyahu a free pass to take a hardline stance against Hamas. They see his actions as, basically giving Netanyahu permission to say no to any concessions and just keep up the pressure, including that blockade on Gaza. They think Trump is taking Israel's side and it's preventing any chance of a fair negotiation.
So they're saying that Trump's involvement is actually making it harder to get a deal.
Exactly.
Wow. And then you add to that the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Yeah.
It's already so bad.
Yeah.
We're talking about 2.3 million people living there. So many of them are displaced Palestinians. They're in a really dire situation.
The blockade that Israel has imposed has just cut off so many essential goods and services. It's leading to shortages of food, medicine, even fuel. The UN has warned about a possible famine, and the healthcare system is barely functioning.
It's heartbreaking to think about the suffering of all those people. They're basically trapped in this conflict zone. And in all of this political back and forth, it's easy to forget that there are actual people stuck in the middle.
Yeah.
Real people whose lives are on hold.
You can't lose sight of the human element here.
Right.
These hostages, people like Eden Alexander, he's a 21-year-old American believed to be one of the hostages.
Right.
These are not just bargaining chips. They're sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, friends, and their families are going through unimaginable pain and uncertainty.
Their stories are a powerful reminder that this conflict isn't just about, political goals or territory. It's about real lives, real families caught in something they have no control over.
And the sources you gave us, they talk about demonstrations in Tel Aviv, families of the hostages demanding their loved ones' release. You can just feel their anguish. It reminds you this isn't just some political game. Real lives are on the line here.
Yeah. Those families, they're in such a tough spot. On the one hand, they see Trump saying he'll bring their loved ones home, like he'll do whatever it takes. But then they see the humanitarian crisis in Gaza getting worse because of that blockade, knowing their loved ones are right there in the middle of it.
It shows the really complicated moral questions that come with hostage situations. Do you give in to the demands of the people holding those hostages, maybe even encouraging them to do it again? Or do you stand firm, even if it means putting the hostages' lives at risk, hoping for a better outcome in the long run? There are no easy answers.
It's like a moral minefield, and it puts the U.S. in a really difficult position. They're trying to protect American citizens abroad, but they also want to support Israel and have their own goals in the region.
And then you add in the fact that the U.S. is now directly talking to Hamas, a group they've called a terrorist organization for years. It's a big change from how the U.S. has acted before, and it's going to have consequences.
For sure. It opens up a whole new set of diplomatic challenges and ethical questions, but it also shows how desperate things are. The U.S. seems willing to try anything to get those hostages back, even if it means breaking the rules they've followed for a long time.
It really shows how unpredictable Trump's foreign policy is. He's shown us over and over again that he's not afraid to shake things up, to do things differently, even if it upsets people or alienates allies. But in this case, it's hard to say if this unusual approach will work.
What about some of the unintended consequences of these secret talks? Like, what could go wrong?
Well, one worry is that these talks could actually make Hamas seem more legitimate to the rest of the world, even though many countries call them terrorists. It might undermine efforts to isolate Hamas and pressure them to stop the violence and accept that Israel has the right to exist.
And how could these talks affect the relationship between the U.S. and Israel?
There's a risk that the U.S.-Israel relationship could be strained if Israel feels like these talks are against their interests. Some Israeli officials have already voiced concerns about the U.S. talking to Hamas without them being fully involved or knowing what's going on. If they see these talks as giving in to a group they consider terrorists, it could cause tension and mistrust between the two allies.
It's a delicate balance. And looking beyond this immediate crisis, what does this mean for the region as a whole?
This situation could really change the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If these talks don't work out, it could lead to even more violence, making it even harder to negotiate in the future. But if they do succeed, it could open up new possibilities for dialogue and conflict resolution, although there would still be many obstacles.
It's a turning point, and there's so much uncertainty. What are some of the scenarios that could play out from here?
Well, one possibility is that Trump's pressure tactics work. Hamas, worried about being isolated and facing military action, decides to release the remaining hostages without any preconditions. That would be a win for the U.S. and Israel, but it might embolden Hamas in the long term. It would show them that taking hostages can get them what they want.
And what if Hamas just refuses to budge?
If they refuse to release the hostages without a permanent ceasefire agreement, things could get a lot worse. Israel might feel they have no choice but to launch a large-scale military operation into Gaza to try and rescue the hostages by force. That would likely mean many casualties on both sides and cause even more damage in Gaza, which is already struggling.
That's a grim thought. Is there a more optimistic scenario? Could these talks actually lead to a breakthrough, maybe even a lasting peace agreement?
It's not likely to happen soon, but the talks could create an opportunity for more serious negotiations down the road. If both sides are willing to compromise to address each other's core concerns, maybe this crisis could be what finally pushes them towards a more comprehensive peace process. But that would take a real change in attitudes and a willingness to make difficult concessions on both sides.
It seems like these next few weeks are going to be really important in determining where this crisis goes. And as we're considering these different scenarios, we have to remember the millions of people living in Gaza who are trapped in this cycle of violence and hardship.
Absolutely. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is a real tragedy happening right now. Beyond all the political calculations and strategies, there are real people suffering. It's a stark reminder that finding a real solution to this conflict isn't just about achieving political goals. It's about making sure that everyone involved has their basic human rights and dignity.
So how do we connect these high-level discussions and possible scenarios back to what's actually happening on the ground in Gaza? What are some of the specific challenges people are facing because of the blockade?
The blockade has had a terrible impact on every aspect of life in Gaza. Imagine a place where hospitals can barely function because they don't have enough medicine and equipment, where families have to ration their food because there's not enough, and where people live in constant fear of violence and uncertainty. That's the reality for millions in Gaza.
The sources we looked at, they describe families struggling to feed their children, patients being denied life-saving medical treatment, and the psychological toll of living under constant threat. These aren't just statistics. These are real people with real stories of hardship and resilience.
One story that really stuck with me was about a young mother who had to make the incredibly difficult decision to send her very sick child to Egypt for treatment, knowing that she might never see her child again because of the restrictions on movement imposed by the blockade. It's just one example of the impossible choices people in Gaza are forced to make every day.
These stories are heartbreaking. It's easy to get caught up in the political details, but we can't forget about the human cost of this conflict.
I agree, and it's important to remember that these hardships are inevitable. They're a direct result of the political decisions being made.
You mentioned earlier that releasing some of the Palestinian prisoners in previous exchanges was controversial in Israel. Can you talk more about that? Why is this such a sensitive issue?
The idea of releasing Palestinian prisoners, especially those who were convicted of violent acts against Israelis, is a very emotional and politically charged issue in Israel. For a lot of Israelis, it feels like a betrayal of justice, like they're ignoring the suffering of the victims and their families. They argue that releasing these prisoners, especially without getting something significant in return from Hamas, sends the message that violence gets rewarded and encourages more attacks.
But for Hamas, those prisoners are seen as freedom fighters, people who are fighting for their national liberation. Releasing them is a key demand, a matter of principle, a necessary step toward any kind of reconciliation.
Exactly. It's a fundamental clash of narratives and perceptions. It makes finding common ground really hard. Many Palestinians see these prisoners as heroes resisting occupation, while many Israelis see them as terrorists who've committed terrible crimes.
It really highlights how deeply ingrained the narratives are on both sides, making it almost impossible to bridge the gap and find a path towards peace.
And it's made even more complicated by the fact that the Israeli public is divided on this issue. Some Israelis support releasing prisoners as a necessary step towards peace, arguing that there can't be reconciliation without addressing the Palestinian prisoners. But others strongly oppose any concessions to Hamas, believing it shows weakness and will only make them bolder.
So this issue of releasing prisoners isn't just a point of contention between Israel and Hamas. It also reflects deep divisions within Israel itself.
Exactly. It's a microcosm of the broader complexities of the conflict, where deeply held beliefs, historical grievances, and competing narratives clash, making it seem almost impossible to find a solution that works for everyone.
So we've got these internal divisions within Israel, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the hostage situation, the secret talks, and Trump's unpredictable actions. It's a lot to untangle. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, it does feel like we're at this crossroads. So many different ways this could go, each with its own risks and benefits. It's really tough to say what will happen next. But maybe we can, I don't know, game it out a little. If you were advising the U.S. government right now, what approach would you suggest?
Well, first things first, the priority has to be getting those hostages released safely. Their lives are on the line, and that's got to be the most important thing. But beyond that, I think the more careful approach is needed. One that's firm about Hamas using violence and taking hostages, but also recognizes how bad the situation is in Gaza and tries to deal with the root causes of the conflict.
Yeah, some people would say that talking to Hamas at all, even for humanitarian reasons, is like rewarding terrorism, that will just encourage them to take more hostages in the future. How do you respond to that? It's a fair point. And it is a tough balance to strike. But completely isolating Hamas and refusing to engage with them in any way, that's not likely to solve anything in the long term. It might even make things worse, make the people in Gaza more extreme and give the hardliners in Hamas more power. I think we need to make a distinction, reject terrorism, but still recognize the humanitarian needs of the people in Gaza. Those are two separate things.
So how do you separate those two things? How do you provide aid without it seeming like you're giving in to Hamas or rewarding them for what they've done?
It takes careful planning and making sure the aid gets directly to the people who need it most. Working with international organizations and NGOs that have a good track record in Gaza. And you have to be clear in your communication, both to the world and to the people in Israel, that this aid isn't about agreeing with what Hamas has done. It's about basic human decency.
Sounds like a very delicate balancing act, trying to keep all those different interests and goals in mind. What about the long-term strategy? What needs to change to break this cycle of violence and create a lasting peace?
Ultimately, any real solution has to address the root causes of the conflict, things like poverty, inequality, and the lack of opportunity that make young Palestinians vulnerable to being recruited by extremist groups. It also means finding a way to create a viable Palestinian state, one that allows for self-determination and economic development.
That's a big ask. It sounds like it would require a fundamental shift in the political landscape, both in Israel and in the Palestinian territories.
It absolutely would. It would require both sides to make difficult compromises and move past those deeply ingrained narratives and that winner-takes-all mentality that has defined the conflict for so long. You'd need leaders on both sides who are brave enough to take risks for peace and challenge the status quo.
And what about the international community? What role can other countries play in supporting a peaceful resolution?
They have a crucial role. They can facilitate dialogue, provide economic assistance, and hold both sides accountable for their actions. Countries with influence in the region, like Egypt and Qatar, can act as mediators, encouraging direct talks and building trust. And the U.S., as a major player, can use its influence to push both sides towards compromise and a negotiated solution.
It sounds like a very multi-pronged approach is needed.
Yeah.
One that addresses the immediate crisis, the humanitarian needs, and the long-term political challenges.
Exactly. It's a complex situation, no easy answers. It's going to take patience, persistence, and a willingness to have those tough conversations and make those difficult choices.
This has been, wow, a real deep dive. So much information and so many insights. I think the key takeaway for our listener is that this is a fluid and complex situation. No easy solutions here. And the choices that are made in the coming weeks and months are going to have very real and lasting consequences.
And as we're trying to figure out this complicated situation, it's so important to remember the human cost. The lives of those hostages, their families, and millions of people in Gaza, they're all directly affected by the decisions being made. This isn't just some political game. It's a human tragedy happening right now.
It is. And it's a reminder that behind all the headlines and political speeches, there are real people whose lives are hanging in the balance. Their stories deserve our attention, our empathy, and our commitment to finding a peaceful end to this conflict.
I agree.
Well, on that note, that's going to do it for this deep dive. Thank you so much for listening.